Hello everyone, welcome to our Thursday workshop for DataSoc. I have here with me Kevin Cunningham. Kevin is a lecturer in statistics and he is also the managing director in an Irish polling firm. He'll tell you a little bit more about himself in a minute. Just want to say thanks everyone for coming on, and make sure to fire any questions you have in the chat, and I'll bring them up to Kevin as we go. So Kevin, you want to just give a bit of a spiel about yourself?
Yeah, I'll say first, I guess, that my kind of undergrad background, when I was doing an undergrad, I did a course called MSIS. I just mentioned to the lads there a minute ago, sort of a data sciencey, kind of computer sciencey course. And I only did it because I thought I'd be good at that sort of stuff. But what I found that it's the sort of thing you can apply to anything. And I was always interested in politics because a good friend of mine, his dad was a politician, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And I didn't really have any political persuasion. Like, I wasn't left wing or right wing or anything really. Like, I probably would have been maybe a little bit more right wing. I think if I think back to myself back then, because I liked, betting markets and predicting stuff, and the idea of a financial market and all that sort of stuff really appealed to me. Things being efficient and mathematically elegant and all that sort of stuff. Then I guess the global financial crisis happened and made me pay a little bit more attention to politics and have more than just a superficial understanding of it. And then I worked for PwC, like an accounting firm, doing consulting, that sort of stuff, which turned out to be a lot of nonsense. And then I left. I did like a master's in the UK in statistics in Oxford, and that was cool. And then I started a PhD in politics, so I was kind of able to combine the stats with the politics. And halfway through that, I started working for the British Labour Party, and I worked for them for 4 or 5 years as kind of their chief number nerd, basically. Which was really cool because politics doesn't actually have that many people who were kind of numerically literate, certainly at that time. It was a kind of an emerging thing. Political parties, particularly like the Labour Party, probably more so than any other party, had enormous amount of data. So I went over to the job. I started in the Labour Party, and I remember thinking, like, I'll just see how this goes, I'll see what they have and see if there's anything useful I can do. And like, I opened up their kind of database, and I found like a gold mine of information about the general public. And like, you wouldn't believe the amount of information. As a colleague of mine once said, we achieved what Stasi had tried to achieve without any other kind of hoo-ha or whatever. So they had an enormous data set. And what we were doing was very similar to the Democrats at the time. They'd come out of the Obama election and they started to really focus on data. The 2008 election there, there was a lot of coverage about the Obama data cave, and I was kind of in close contact with those guys. Certainly at the time, there was very few people who were kind of numerically, doing data modeling to drive campaign strategies for political parties. There was almost nobody in Europe really doing it, but there was the guys in the States, Dan Wagner and Elon Kriegel. And I was working a lot with those guys, and it was almost like we created a group, and I joined this other thing called the Analyst Institute, which was an organization for data analysts working in politics and academics. And it was constrained on the left, which might sound unusual but if you understand more about the differences between how left-wing and right-wing parties have kind of formed, data is a much bigger tool for left-wing parties, because historically speaking, left-wing parties have had a major part of their organization has been trying to get their voters to the polls. Okay, so they tend to have people who are lower socioeconomic grades, and it's trying to ensure that they vote. They typically don't vote, and that's the big problem. So they spend a lot of time and energy on this thing called GOTV or whatever. I'll talk about that stuff later if you want. But so yeah, I was doing a lot of that stuff. and then I came back to Ireland, did a bit of work for the Irish Labour Party, the SDLP, the Australian Labour Party, just whoring it around to whatever political party and campaign was going at the time. I started lecturing in statistics at the same time, and then after the 2016 general election, I set up a polling company, Ireland Thinks, and I've been kind of running regular polls with Ireland Thinks, but the function of the polling company I'm running, and the reason why I set it up, was because as someone working within a political party, I realized that you need to have really reliable data. Okay, so like you've got two sides to this. It's how good is your modeling? How good are you at kind of building statistical tools for understanding what you can do and trying to understand the data? But then also the source of the data is really important. So if the quality of the data that you're using is crap, then it doesn't really matter how good your models are. It's garbage in, garbage out, as they call it, right? So in relation to that, after working for the British Labour Party and after working for the Irish Labour Party, we've been using polling companies for which the data was rubbish, basically. And they're very prominent and major polling companies that household names that people would know. But the data was terrible because the panels of people they were relying on to answer these questions were also being asked all sorts of questions like Lucozade, about what's your favorite soft drink, and listing 45 different soft drinks, and rate these, cars out of 10 to people that wouldn't give a shit about cars. And the only people then who were left on these panels to answer our questions about politics were oddballs. They were kind of unusual people who were willing to spend hours at a time just rating cars, and they're not normal, they're not representative of the population as a whole. So that's why I set up Ireland Thinks, because I wanted to have a reliable data source that I knew it was well conceived. I'm not really a businessman in that respect. Like, I'm not looking for global domination or anything with Ireland Thinks, but I'm using it with other academics. I don't know if anyone studies in politics at the minute. I think you've some great lectures like Yas Elking and Aidan Regan, and I've been working with those guys on academic papers, and David Farrell, using the Ireland Thinks data because it's more reliable data. So it's kind of trying to get research level quality data to understand what's going on in politics, I guess, but also, my interests are outside of politics more than everything really. So that's kind of where that has all come from, and that's where I am at the minute. Like, I have this polling company, Ireland Thinks, but I'm also involved with a whole load of other polling companies in the UK to help them to develop methods, and some campaign groups in Europe. So I've worked on worked for the German Green Party relatively recently, and I did some work on the Emmanuel Macron presidential campaign as well. Just little bits and pieces, kind of doing things like segmentation analysis and trying to understand why people are voting the way they are and all that sort of stuff, basically. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I guess you touched on a lot of stuff there, but just to jump back to when you were talking about your experience working at the Labour Party, you mentioned a really, really broad data set. I think you called it a gold mine. What are some insights that you might be able to draw from a data set like that? What are some of the things you might figure out about the electorate?
Yeah, so we would have had, every party is allowed to have this, a list of everyone that is a voter or in the electorate that could potentially vote. In the UK, at least, and things are changing with GDPR, but we match that against what Experian, the company, was collecting. So Experian is a very unusual credit rating agency. Their entire function is to work out whether you are someone who is able to pay back in a loan. But in doing so, they've gathered enormous amounts of data, doing surveys, and transposing that survey data onto those people, and using people's internet browsing history as well to classify the types of people that people are based on what they're doing. And we were able to buy into some of that data and match that against voters. what that had the net effect of doing was being able to identify on an individual door-to-door basis the propensity for someone to, listen to our message, the likelihood that they were going to be someone who could vote Labour, who wouldn't vote Labour, and we could run our campaigns around that. We would obviously knock on doors, collect information about whether people said that they were voting for the party, and collecting data on whether people were in. And I think this is one innovation I kind of made, which was the not-ins, which was building models on even the likelihood of you answering the door at a given time of the day during the week. And that's just so that when on polling day, trying to fit all this stuff into the organisation, where on polling day in the UK, as I mentioned, a major function of left-wing parties is to get out the vote. So how do you most efficiently get as few volunteers to knock on the exact right doors, in terms of the doors being people that are in, people for whom a door knock will actually increase their propensity to vote on that given day, and also, like, have we spoken to them before, and all sorts of other stuff. So a lot of that is just like models and experiments to try to figure out how exactly do we do this. And I mentioned the Analysts Institute, this kind of group of people who really focus on all this stuff. And you actually have to work for or be connected to a progressive party to be allowed into the Analysts Institute. So while at a student level, it might feel slightly different in terms of, like, I generally know that the makeup of left and right and where people are, depending on what degree they're doing, right? Because that's my job to know how people vote. But what you find, I think, in politics is that the left has tended to be more sophisticated in this regard for decades, because those on the right are focusing on a very different type of campaign, which is more kind of the air war. Their voters vote anyway, so we do a lot more ground war stuff, which is very data intensive, and they do a lot more air war stuff. I'm not even sure if I answered your question there, Sam, at all.
No, you absolutely did. How would you describe air war versus ground war to someone who's never heard of it before?
Oh yeah, so like in politics, when you're working in a campaign, for whatever reason, people use military terms to describe things, and the ground war is the idea of, so a political party is really split into two parts. There's the kind of permanent organization. It's like the civil service of the political party, that people, permanent jobs, like me or whatever. I was in there with a permanent job. I could have worked there for 40 years or whatever, right? And we're usually preoccupied with the ground war stuff, which is door knocking, postering, meetings, conference, organizing the day-to-day stuff that doesn't really depend too much. I mean, we're trying to sell the leader, whoever that leader is, but we have to remain somewhat independent of that leader, because eventually a new leader will come along and we'll have to be able to deal with that person. The other part of the organization is the air war, which really surrounds the leader himself or herself. And they will typically bring in staff close to them, usually people that they've trusted for a long time, friends of theirs frequently, often not as professional, not as well versed in how political parties run. So you often have this funny environment where the kind of permanent staff are really, get frustrated with the kind of more senior people, effectively, who are actually less knowledgeable about what they're doing than the people who are kind of permanent staff members. So those guys who are around the leader are more likely to commission the polling, right? So I do public opinion polling, and the air war focuses on, what does the leader say when he goes on the radio, or what do they need to be concerned? Not exactly what they say, but what do they need to be concerned about? What demographic groups do they need to appeal to? A lot of that sort of started in the 80s with Margaret Thatcher, in fact, where Saatchi and Saatchi were kind of an ad agency that started developing ideas about campaigns that the Conservative Party could apply to win over sort of Labour voters, basically. The famous poster which says Labour is not working, and it's a long kind of queue of people who are unemployed, and that's kind of the start of all that sort of stuff. But that's kind of the air war side of things. And like, I do both, I guess. I've done more of the airwar stuff more recently, I guess, if I'm continuing with that sort of definition, in the UK. So I did that with the 2017 UK general election. I kind of went back and did some of the polling for Jeremy Corbyn for that election, which was good. And we did very well. And then I didn't do the 2019, which we didn't do well in. Wasn't one. Nothing to do with me, really.
And how would you hear a lot with especially about Cambridge Analytica and all that. How do targeted ad campaigns and stuff fit into that? Is that still as prominent as it was a couple of years ago when it went kind of exposed in a way?
Yeah, I'd say there's two parts to that, right? So I'll start with the bad side of Cambridge Analytica, right? And the nasty side of the Trump campaign and that sort of stuff is the fact that the ads weren't at the time, which has changed, visible to outsiders. So, if I was to put up an ad, if I was the Labour Party, I want to put up an ad in Britain, a billboard ad, it will be seen, right? So it could easily be accessible by journalists because someone would say, look, there's a billboard ad out here making a complete lie, and the journalist would be able to conceivably query that lie, right? The problem with the Facebook ads is because no one can really see who is being targeted. So you can target things very narrowly, meaning that not everyone can see it. So it's not as easily observed by the media, not as easily scrutinized. And the idea is that you can lie more easily through Facebook ads. Nowadays, obviously, Facebook have this register where if you're registered for the party, that's when you're allowed to do ads, and any ad is kind of stored, filed, and you can see it. Personally, I'm no huge fan of Facebook, but I think the Cambridge Analytica issue is exaggerated. I think I consider that both as someone who has been heavily involved in targeting, data modeling, psychographic profiling of electors, and as an academic who's read the academic papers on this sort of stuff. So like what Cambridge Analytica were doing, which was, part of it was not really very innovative and part of it was clever. So one of the things that they did was they asked people to complete a survey. And the survey was the Big Five personality trait survey. So the Big Five is basically 5 different personality traits. You complete the survey and it tells you how you rank according to these different traits. So one is called openness, so it's how open you are to new experiences. Another is called conscientiousness. It's kind of like how organized you are, or how careless you are. I'm more of a careless mindset, I guess. How neurotic you are, which is essentially a variable for understanding like how do you tend to be kind of worried about like big things and events, and how anxious are you on a day-to-day basis. Anyway, they did that survey, and what they did, which was clever, was they matched it to Facebook likes. So they identified the types of people who are open to things, and they were able to say, oh, those people tend to like certain things on Facebook. Maybe they like LGBT stuff, or they like, whatever it is. And then they made advertisements based on that kind of classification. The impact of that stuff is only as good as the ads. Okay, that's basically it. At the end of the day, like just because you can break people into psychographic groups doesn't mean you're going to be very effective at thereafter. I mean, the Big Five personality traits is actually no better at predicting voting behavior than age and education are, right? So it's not like they've tapped into some secret thing. It's something that's been around for decades, the Big Five, and I used it even before that 2016 election and dumped it because it's not really that good, right? The thing that was interesting and became the calling card for Cambridge Analytica, which is why, and Alexander Nix was able to kind of go around the world and talk about it and kind of sell effectively a product that didn't really have much behind it, was because he'd identified, and other people had as well, that there was a personality trait. Like historically speaking, you could say that people who are open to new experiences were more likely to be left-wing, significantly so. People who weren't were more likely to be right-wing. And there's the conscientiousness one. I mean, there's 5 of them, but only 2 of them were actually predicting anything. The conscientiousness one suggests people who are organised were slightly more likely to be conservative as well, but not very significantly. The innovation that happened relatively recently was that people, as we've observed now, who voted for Trump and Brexit, were a little bit more likely to be neurotic, which was something that wasn't observed in political behaviour previously. It's not that it was majorly significant or majorly important, but that was kind of what they did. The difference between Cambridge Analytica and everyone else was actually quite minimal. The Clinton campaign would have had access to, I'm no fan of Donald Trump, I think it's probably fairly easy to figure that out, but the Clinton campaign would have had no disadvantage really. They would have had access to equivalent segmentations at the back end of Facebook, which would have been doing a much more efficient job than Cambridge Analytica's survey would have done, right? So what they actually had was actually quite limited, but your man was able to sell it, and they were willing to work for, you know, a whole load of people that other people wouldn't have been willing to work for. Like I would have been asked to work for UKIP, to work for the Brexit campaign, but I refused to do so, just because just don't work for those guys or whatever. I mean, obviously some people don't want to do that stuff. And then they did some other kind of nasty campaigns in Africa, trying to manipulate people not to vote, and sort of very deliberate voter suppression stuff. But yeah, all that sort of stuff in relation to targeting, like, it's only as useful as the ad itself. Really, like, you can, tends to be more effective in terms of predicting behavior is this thing by a guy called Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called, I can't remember the book, but the theory is called the 5 Moral Foundations, and it talks about left and right, and it's really interesting. That's a much better sort of predictor of behavior. I mean, we were able to, in the Labour Party, identify people's Facebook accounts, whatever, and do all that sort of stuff, but, you know, it doesn't really, I mean, the scale of it that I've seen vastly is scary, right, in terms of the extent to which people can know information about people. But the ability, even with more sophisticated of models, to actually do anything with that is actually quite limited. And I think it's worth people knowing that, I guess. You know, the models are only as good as the underlying data, and sometimes the data doesn't actually tell you very much at all.
You mentioned briefly that a big priority for left-wing parties is encouraging voter turnout. And I think, if I'm not wrong, the turnout is expected to be higher than ever this year for the US. Do you think that's an indicator of democratic success for this election?
It's a really good question, man. So yeah, like in Texas, the turnout is almost already as high as it was previously. Texas is really unusual because Texas usually has a very low turnout. And there's a relationship between marginality and turnout. So when people see that something is going to be marginal, as for the first time Texas is, people are driven to the polls to vote on it. So there's a massive enthusiasm in Texas. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're all Democrats. There is some evidence to suggest that of the polls that have been cast so far, the Democrats are massively in the lead, but that Republicans do intend to vote later on polling day. It's uncertain. I mean, I think of the Scottish independence referendum where turnout was something like 90%. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was huge, right? But it didn't differ from what the polls suggested. And there's this idea that as turnout increases, it actually gets closer and closer to what the polling data will suggest, because the opportunity for differential turnout declines. You know, so if turnout increases, you know, the Trump voters are also turning out. Like, it's impossible for turnout to increase and it just to be one side. You know, so yeah. So I mean, turnout is a huge thing. Like, it's one of those things that's kind of underreported, and because or it's not focused on enough, because there's more people in this coming election who I think will determine the election on the basis of whether they turn out or not, as opposed to switching sides. I did a poll just out of my own interest in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, the kind of 2 states that you need to win, to try to identify these switchers and non-voters and stuff, to see what do they actually think. And I did like 25 interviews of them. And it was interesting just to understand how they viewed the whole contest or whatever, and what was the trade-offs that they were considering. And was interesting that it would appear to be, if it wasn't for COVID-19, that Donald Trump was coasting among these guys. So there's a lot of people who said they were going to vote for Donald Trump, apparently because of the economy. He's perceived as being performed relatively well in the economy. They don't like him as a person, but they do agree with his policies. But COVID-19 has annoyed a lot of these people as well, and in particular his downplaying of the virus at the start, which he subsequently said was, admitted was real, which made people think, why were you lying to us, basically? And that's what they didn't like, because a lot of these guys had voted for him previously. I felt he was lying to them.
Is it, do you see much of a discrepancy between different polls? Is there a big difference between the results in a lot of them? And how do you identify which poll to trust?
Do you mind if I just grab someone's ringing the doorbell?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No problem.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
no worries.
You were saying about polls?
Yeah, I was just saying, is there much of a discrepancy between maybe the most popular polls, and how, as a consumer, how do you identify which polls to trust?
Yeah. Okay. This is a really good question, right? So, like, what people frequently do, and you see this on Twitter or whatever, is people kind of do poll of polls, whatever, where they basically add effectively the garbage with the good. And if you were savvy, if you wanted to make a bit of money on betting on politics, a really good idea is just throw the garbage out and focus on the really good polls, because the general public, when they are betting on politics, take these poll of polls quite seriously. And, so one example was the 2019 European elections. So the best polling company in the UK is definitely YouGov, and there's a lot of crap in the UK in particular. There's a lot of companies that are just feeding off, they're all feeding off one data source, which is a kind of a really discounted source of people, basically people who are just answering bloody everything. And so all these guys, all these polling companies are feeding off a separate data source to YouGov, who are doing a much better job of what they're doing. And, in that particular election, because there are those new parties, it made things a little bit more uncertain for polling. And there was a massive difference between YouGov and the other parties. And, I think I put like 800 quid on the Labour Party getting under 14%, which is like 8 to 1. It was insane. So in terms of trying to figure out who's better, I wouldn't either trust Nate Silver. He doesn't really know much about polling. There's a tendency to assume that polls that are face-to-face or by telephone are better than polls that are conducted online. I certainly used to think that, but nowadays I think it's the reverse in some respect. There's garbage online polls, and then there's really good online polls. The polling company, again, as I said, I would trust the most is YouGov. The AAPOR did a piece of research to analyze the ability for online polling companies to predict known events, and YouGov came out top. And that's because they use this thing that I also use, which is called propensity score matching, and before they're weighting. And then they do that based on attitudes. It's a technique, I guess, that they do, and I do as well. And it just means you're going to get more accurate results, because you're weighting effectively not just by demographics, but by attitudes and by the complexity between attitudes and demographics and all sorts of other stuff. So there's big differences. I mean, I shouldn't talk about Irish polling companies because they could sue me, I guess. But yeah, there are ones that are rubbish. Like, I mean, you can even just a very cursory examination of the differences between what we're all coming out with. Fianna Fáil are this, Fine Gael are this, and Sinn Féin are that. You can see which ones are the outliers. You can see which polling company is miles out every time. Quite prominent ones, But yeah, I would suggest looking at the individual polls. Like, some of them have too many old people, some of them have too few old people. Like in the US, they don't have to produce the tables. They don't have to say what percentage of old or young people or whatever, and people with low or high levels of education are actually in the poll itself. And that that means that in some cases the data is complete bonkers. It's really bad. Like in the 2016 election, there's a thing called weighting, where you're tweaking, you're tuning the poll to make sure it's a little bit more accurate. If you need to do a lot of tuning, it means that the underlying poll is trash, and that's what they were doing last time. They were like, normally in a normal poll you'd be weighting. The highest weight you might have is 2.5 or 3 or whatever. If you have some demographic that's hard to get and you have to use it or whatever. In the US, some of those state level pollings were weighting young black men by 30. So one response was in some cases worth 300 times some of the lowest responses in the poll, who were weighted like 0.1. So yeah, there's some really serious crap out there. That's why I was with a friend of mine, started doing some state level polling to try to understand what was going on. And one of the things I found out in doing that was, yeah, it is really, really hard to find African American voters. They do not respond to opinion polls at all, for whatever reason, and that is really tricky in terms of trying to get an accurate result, basically.
So we might jump to a few questions in the chat here. So Justine asks, how data savvy are Irish political parties?
Not very at all, and I think that's because they're not very centralized. Depending on the party, Fianna Fáil are the least centralized, so they're like, although as I said, there's two levels to this: the kind of national level polling and that sort of stuff. And the general secretary in Fianna Fáil is actually excellent. Like, he's a really, really smart guy, and he's very data savvy. In terms of the sort of stuff that we'd be doing in the Labour Party or the Democrats would have done, none of these parties are at the races, apart from probably Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin definitely do in Northern Ireland what, to some extent, what we were doing in Britain with the Labour Party, in terms of, identifying supporters and knocking them out and that sort of stuff. The reason why in Ireland they're not savvy is because each politician is running an independent operation. So there's no ability to share data across constituencies, which would inform how you might, canvass across different constituencies. There's no kind of sharing of resources at all in Irish politics, because a lot of people are being elected independently, because they're a very good canvasser and that sort of stuff. Like, some of them are very good. I mean, I'd say also Willie O'D has a very good thing going on, and he's been running it for years, and that's why he gets elected. But he has an excellent sort of system. It's fairly, bootstrapped sort of system, but like, at the end of the day, it's just the technique of what you're doing. Like, are you doing the right thing rather than producing glossy maps and charts and stuff? There's lots of people who will do segmentations and all sorts of nonsense, but like, in practical terms, like, a lot of stuff people do in politics has no practical use if you're actually running a political party. But if I was to rank them in terms of data savviness, I would say, my guess, this is purely guesswork, I would say that Sinn Féin are probably the best. I would say, in terms of the ground operation, like, though the Fianna Fáil General Secretary is really good, I'm not sure, they might use that e-canvasser thing, but I wouldn't say they'd be the greatest. But yeah, in general, they're not very good. I think Fine Gael have surprised me in terms of the fact that they're not very good either, to be honest.
So Callum is asking here, I guess, what kind of tools and technology that you personally would use?
Yeah, so initial Google Analytics, not for my stuff, no. So one of the what tools I use R. Will be the no. I don't know if you guys use R. Do you? You probably do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of standard sort of tool. That would be the first thing I'd use. I'd like even within R, I was able to build a system that would every night over update. This was, I don't know what this at this stage. How long are we out now? This is 8 years ago. Things have moved on even since then. But I built this kind of labor stats system which would update every night the estates. We broke the entire country, the UK, into 300 house blocks, which you'd used for a canvas round. And then every night, the priorities of which houses should be canvassed or which estate should be canvassed would update based on a whole series of different factors and polling data that was coming in. In terms of Google Analytics and that sort of stuff, I wouldn't really use that. I'm usually looking. What you find yourself is that, if you went onto Twitter, right, and you looked at opinion on Twitter, polls on Twitter, as I'm sure you well know, Twitter is very much a microcosm of a certain subset of Irish society. I'm not being sort of populist, I don't think, in saying this, but a poll I did asked people, were they on Twitter and how many followers they had on Twitter, because it's not just whether people are on Twitter, but who actually creates the content that you see when you're on Twitter. And it's disproportionately people on higher income, higher status jobs. Lecturers, right, have loads of followers, right? News readers have loads of followers. Journalists have loads of followers. They're not representative of the country as a whole, right? So they drive the content, and the people on Twitter who are also not represented drive to what extent certain things get shown, and that sort of stuff. The reason I'm saying this is because there's two ways of looking at this sort of stuff. Either you have a kind of a top-down approach, a kind of controlled approach to kind of gathering your data, like opinion poll is, right, by ringing random telephone numbers. That's a perfectly random sample, and I'm directly trying to get the opinions of the elderly, lower educated people who live in rural areas that will be nowhere near Twitter or anything like that. Stuff like Google Analytics and Twitter and anything like that are predicated on the person, the respondent coming to you. It's like opt-in information as opposed to the direct control of getting the information yourself. So yeah, that's just one thing I'd say about that. I use R, basically, is probably the number one, and Excel. Combination of the two is always good. Yeah.
So we've a follow-on question from Eva. She's asking, where do you and the parties get your data from? So the sort of data sources that you would use.
Yeah, so the Airwar is kind of polling data. That depends on how you do the polling. I could explain where I'm getting my polling data. I'm getting the polls done. And in terms of the Groundwar, that's from door knocking or buying it in from companies like Experian, like big data suppliers. Now, again, with GDPR, you're not really allowed to sell, or you're not allowed to sell data. So I can't, sell any data about any particular person. There was a period in which people were making a lot of money on that. So things have changed in that regard. In relation to how I'm polling people, so I have an online panel, but the panel has been constructed extremely carefully. You can't join my panel, for example. It has been composed initially by doing random random digit dial telephone calls to loads of people over the course of 3 years. And so conceptually, if I'm to call a random telephone number now, anyone here has a chance of being called, right? And the chance is equal, right? So if it's a completely random telephone call, you all have an equal chance. That's a really good technique towards getting a good sample of data, right? And it's from that very large data set of around 30,000 people, plus a couple of people that I had to get through some Facebook ads. From that 30,000, I condensed that down into a smaller group of people that are representative, and then I asked those people to answer my survey. So, it's more likely that in my initial thing that I'm going to get some people more than others, people who like politics in particular, and the subsequent survey happens from kind of a subset that's like representative.
What's the kind of sample size you would have then in that secondary survey? If you were coming down from, say, 30,000.
Yeah, so we're getting down from 30 to around 4,000.
Okay.
Yeah, 24,000 I actually get asked to take part in the survey, and about 1,000 or so will respond. And that's good. So you also want to keep the response rate up. So if the response rate is really low in a survey, it means that there's some bias. So like if I ask people really, if I do a survey on people's sexual preferences, right, sexual behavior, the response rate is going to be low, right? Because certain people are going to respond to that and some people aren't. And it's going to be skewed because the people that are going to respond are going to be more open about their sexual preferences and sexual behaviors. People who are less open are not going to respond. So your results are going to be skewed, right? So making sure that as many people as possible actually respond is a fairly good test of understanding whether like the poll is overall representative. But like a lot of the stuff, right, just to say, in this is all theoretical statistics. Like it isn't a topic theoretical statistics, but that's like a lot of what being a good analyst requires, like understanding bias and theories behind that, rather than running a few lines of R code is child's play, right? It's really easy, but understanding and being able to scrutinize and understand the biases and the underlying data sets, that's the real skill. I think, and don't go into finance because waste energy.
So Emma is asking, I guess, what are the sorts of statistical models that you would use, that you'd apply?
So there's one called, it's now officially called MRP, which is multi-level modeling with post-stratification. That's a model for if you didn't have enough. So like in the UK, the 650 constituencies, right? So if you wanted to work out what's going on in, North Westminster constituency, right? If you did a survey of 20,000 people, you're only going to have around 40 people who are in North Westminster, right? So the MRP model is a way of kind of dealing with that limitation, right? So it's able to kind of borrow data from outside the constituency, effectively, if I explain it this way, and make relatively accurate predictions. So the MRP model is a very good model for predicting constituency level stuff. Multi-level modeling is really good for predicting stuff when you don't have enough data or you have too many different categories that you have to predict, basically. That's kind of what you might use for. I think YouGov are meant to publish their MRP for this election, for the US presidential election. I don't know when that's going to happen, but they're meant to. Again, though, a lot of it just comes down to like really understanding biases. Like one time, there was a referendum a number of years ago around abolishing the Shannon, and the polls typically had around 60-40, or no, sorry, about 65-35 in favor of abolishing the Shannon. But the people that actually wanted to abolish it, when you ask them how enthusiastic they were to vote, they weren't as enthusiastic. The people who wanted to keep it, and it stands to reason, people who want to keep it obviously believe in the thing. They obviously think it's useful for some reason. So they're more motivated and they were more enthusiastic. And so even though there was a 65-35 advantage for those that were in favor of abolishing it, it wasn't abolished. It was that the referendum, I think, was like 52-48 in favor of retaining the Shannon. And that was because of differential turnout. And that's the sort of stuff that really I do a lot of modeling on, like what's the probability of someone actually turning out, and it's just not done enough, and it's a real determinant, especially when politics is very partisan. When there's two camps. It's back in Ireland in the 80s with just Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Really, like Fianna Fáilers wouldn't vote for Fine Gaelers, Fine Gaelers wouldn't vote for Fianna Fáilers. The only difference was who's going to turn out, who actually cares more about their party this week, or this month, or this year, because the economy's doing well or badly or whatever. And that's what determines outcomes, and that's what will determine the US presidential election as well. I could think of loads of different models. In terms of modelling multi-party elections, there's a really good academic paper on it, but I'd end up getting quite technical on that. I would recommend people getting into Bayesian statistics, because it's a really good thing to use for this sort of stuff. Yeah.
Has there been any major developments in the past 3 or 4 years, or do you see any coming in the horizon that you think might completely change how this field operates?
A lot of people are doing kind of natural language processing. So, when you ask a poll, you can't ask, if I ask the guys here an opinion poll, I would have to determine the categories. So if I were to say, let's say I'm ridiculously narrow-minded, right? And I sort of say, how much do you like the government? And I have give categories like the government's great, the government's good, or the government's okay, rather than including the government as bad. Okay, that's obviously a limitation. Think about other questions then. How do you feel about Leo Varadkar? How do you feel about Micheál Martin? What are the categories that I'm going to offer you? I have no understanding really of how ordinary people are going to respond to this. So you have to go for an open-ended question. The problem with open-ended questions is people will respond to that very differently. So someone might think that Micheál Martin is weak. Some people might think he's watery. Those two things basically mean the same thing. So how do you kind of combine all these things to kind of reclassify open-ended questions? That's something I'm working on at the minute with a guy called Stefan Mueller, who's in UCD as well. And we're just looking at how do you kind of use synonyms to kind of classify people and try to understand. I mean, in Ireland, there's the rise of the far right will be a thing. People will get very excited about that. And I think it's not something to get excited about because it kind of ends in a kind of nasty place. But in terms of the field of the application of data politics, I started doing a lot more moving away from data a little bit, like trying to do focus groups, trying to understand people, applying the same sort of understanding of data and stats in terms of how do I ask people a question in a focus group without being biased? How do I get an unbiased interpretation of a series of interviews by, trying to match the interpretations that these people have across different questions? I think you actually get a lot more from more open-ended stuff rather than data, which comes sometimes very closed. But yeah, I mean, politics is very much in flux. The European Union will be a bigger thing in the future, and I think that will be a major focus of how maybe people will be modelling European elections more closely. At the minute, they don't really matter. Yeah, I haven't really answered any of the questions there. I could talk about models all day long, to be honest with you. Like CART models, they're really good. They're cool. Latent class analysis, that's class as well.
Brilliant. I think we might wrap up then in a bit. If anyone has any other last minute questions, they might pop them into the chat. But thanks a million, Kevin, for coming on. It was really interesting chat. It was brilliant to have you.
Thanks a million, Sam. I'd love to ask people, what are they doing? What are people studying? Can I ask that sort of question?
If anyone wants to let us know, just pop it in the chat and I'll read it out. But
what people are studying, or you said you're doing finance, is it?
Yeah, economics and finance. I'm doing my final year of that. But we've a pretty good mix in the society. It's a good, like a 30-30 split between business, science, and engineering.
Okay, very good.
Ben, you asked a question. You said big factors that impact voter turnout.
Yeah, marginality of the race. So actually, I may as well talk with the US presidential election maybe just before you go off. The marginality of the race. So that's a huge thing in Texas. That's why people are turning out. Campaign effects. So the reason why people do door knocking is because there's been hundreds of studies that show if you knock on a door, you increase the probability of them turning out by around 10%. If you phone them, it's like 4%. If you send them a mail, it's like 1%. The reason for all that stuff is the more personal contact that you make with the prospective voter, the more likely that they're going to actually turn out. So people have been developing techniques to work out how do we get a network of friends and families to convince their relatives to turn out. You saw it here with the marriage equality referendum, where people were there was talk to your granny campaign, and that was the whole thing about trying to influence elderly people to change their mind and stuff. But that personal relationship is the most influential, really. Partisanship is also important. You'll see in this election, turnout's going to be up. The only country where turnout is enormous, where it isn't mandatory. So it's obviously mandatory in Australia, but in Malta, turnout's regularly around 90%, and they don't have to vote. But that's because Malta is unbelievably partisan. Like, they have the exact same electoral system as we have. 5-seat constituency, STV, which all incentivizes multi-party politics. But they've only 2 parties, and those 2 parties get 50% pretty much every election, because it's unbelievably partisan. I think that's a huge feature of the whole thing. People in lower socioeconomic grades tend to be less likely to vote. Younger people tend to be less likely to vote. A lot of it is predicated on political knowledge, really, and a lot of things influence that. I mean, like, I have mature students in some of my classes, and in some areas, like, I notice mature students are a little bit ahead of younger students because they have that kind of life experience or whatever, that they've been through recessions, they've been through all that stuff, and that influences their ability to kind of interpret political information when I'm having lectures on politics, and that's definitely a thing.
I guess I just have one more question then before we wrap up. So this is more related to the last general election in Ireland. Obviously, the turnout from Sinn Féin was for me incredibly surprising. Were you surprised by that result? Did you see that coming in a way? Do you think it might have been possible that they would have done even better if they had more TDs and more constituencies? Or
yeah, well, interestingly enough, I didn't actually predict to get that exact number of seats on the Dave McWilliams podcast. I think it was the week before. And yeah, I wasn't too surprised. And partly that's because I do my own polling, so I can see the data and I trust it. But if they'd run more candidates, they would have won much more. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we'll finish up there before it gets too late, Kevin. So thanks a million for coming on again. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting Sam and Austin as well. Thanks a million. Good.
Thanks everyone
for the future as well.
Sorry.
Good luck with the future.
Yeah. Oh, thanks a lot. Thank you. So, okay, we'll wrap up there. Thanks everyone. Make sure to go onto our social media page there and keep an eye out for our next events. We have another speaker next Tuesday and another workshop the following Thursday. So, thanks everyone.